Okay, so we've talked about prokaryotes, and prokaryotes have a cell membrane. That's pretty accurate right there, I'd say. And a ring of DNA, which is called a nucleoid. They also have ribosomes. And they can have a structure called a pilus, a sex pilus, which they can transfer little bits of DNA from one bacterium to another, but they don't actually have sexual reproduction. They just share little plasmids, little chunks of DNA that they have from one to another, allowing them to increase their genetic diversity and things like that. But overall, that's about it. They also, of course, can have different kinds of cell walls, which I've not drawn here. I'll just draw a little segment of it. A wall made of often peptidoglycan. And of course, archaea have a very similar structure to this as well, just with cell walls composed of different carbohydrates, and they would have different DNA in the nucleoid. They're distantly related to bacteria. But those prokaryotes are small, and once again, these are very small. They don't have a nucleus. They have DNA in a ring called a nucleoid. They have ribosomes to make proteins. They have, liquid cytoplasm in here. They have a wall. They have a cell membrane and a sex pilus here. To transfer DNA between bacteria for horizontal gene transfer. So genes transferring from one organism to another. But what we're going to talk about in this lecture are the protists, which used to be in a kingdom known as Protista. And this group includes some pretty large organisms and some that are almost as small or even as small as some of those prokaryotes. In this group, as we see in this diagram, if you look, this is from my college biology book, and all of these pink organisms here are what we would now call protists, and then the blue this is animal kingdom, fungi, and plant. So you can see that the protists are not a clade because it includes all of these organisms, leaves out plants, animals, and fungi, and then includes this one over here, the conoflagellates, I think it is. So it's not a true clade, and if you include plants, fungi, and animals in the clade, then it's just pretty much all the eukaryotes. So the protists are not a clade. There are a lot of different organisms that are distantly related to each other. And down here, by the way, are the archaea and oops, sorry, I bumped the microphone. The archaea and the bacteria. So eukaryotes originate in the Precambrian through the process of endosymbiosis roughly 1.5 billion years ago. And I think you already know the traits of a eukaryote if I were to ask you this in class, but they have membrane-bound organelles. And what those organelles do is they make a lot of different rooms within the cell. So those different rooms are all composed of membrane, which increases the surface area available to those components, which allows the cell to be bigger and still survive. Because as you may know, as a cell increases in size, its surface area to volume ratio drops dramatically. And that's a problem. Because once again, volume is all of the space in the cell, so that determines how much stuff the cell needs to survive. And surface area, which is out here, tells you how much stuff the cell can actually get in at any given time. And as you get bigger and bigger, volume increases at a much higher rate than surface area, which means surface area to volume as a ratio drops dramatically. And so one of the organelles, other than the nucleus, which is of course very important, that we see are the evolution of the mitochondria and also the chloroplast. And I ask which came first. And if you draw a simple cladogram like I've done here, the easiest explanation is that mitochondria evolved first from bacteria because they're found in plants and in animals, and that chloroplasts evolved later in plants. And what's really cool is if you look at chloroplasts or mitochondria and look at their structure, they have ribosomes, right? Just like bacteria, and they have a nucleoid, a ring of DNA, just like bacteria. So they appear very structurally similar to bacteria. Now, if you take this nucleoid and you run a test, you'll find that chloroplasts come out on a cladogram as being closely related to cyanobacteria, which are photosynthetic bacteria. And mitochondrial DNA comes out related to other types of bacteria, like you see here, aerobic bacteria, bacteria that use oxygen to make, or not to make energy, but to release energy from food. And the way we think this happened is this process of endosymbiosis, where we had an ancestral cell, this ancestral eukaryotic cell, basically, that at some point engulfed an aerobic bacterium. So an aerobic bacterium is a bacterium that can utilize oxygen to extract energy from food. That bacterium was brought in through the process of endocytosis, but rather than being digested like the items we saw in lab, like when paramecia engulf yeast, instead what happens is those bacteria lived inside the cell and eventually became organelles over the millennia as their genes, some of their genes were transferred to the nucleus and things like that. They became mitochondria. Meanwhile, the same thing happens in the ancestors of plants with photosynthetic bacteria. They had the same process occur, just like when we saw Paramecium bursaria in lab. It has algae living in it. Well, this, in this case, rather than algae, we have a prokaryote, cyanobacteria, for example, becoming engulfed inside of this cell. This cell already has mitochondria, and now this this organism becomes over time a plastid. Plastids, there are several kinds of plastids, but the one you're most familiar with is the chloroplast. And they have a ring of DNA and their own ribosomes as well. What's cool about these is there's all kinds of evidence that they are basically derived from bacteria. And some of that evidence is shown here. The enzymes and transport systems in the membranes of these organelles are homologous with those of bacteria. Both chloroplasts and mitochondria pinch in half through the process of binary fission. If you remember that from Bio 1, binary fission. And that's when a cell, one cell pinches in half. That looks awful, but pinches in half and becomes two cells. No mitosis involved. They just pinch in half, and they all have a ring of DNA, which, if you recall, is called a nucleoid. And that pinches in half as well during binary fission. So it copies itself and then pinches in half, making two nucleoids, one in each cell. So it divides and creates two. These organelles are also the same size as bacteria, and what's really cool is they're sensitive to the same antibiotics that bacteria are sensitive to. A lot of antibiotics target ribosomes. So because the ribosomes in these organelles in mitochondria, in chloroplasts, are similar to bacteria, those same antibiotics will damage those organelles. All right, so the kingdom Protista was a kingdom, at least we thought it was, or at least we called it one when I was in college, but now it is no longer called a kingdom. But we still use this word informally, this thing, Protista, and we often call the members that used to be in this group Protists. 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 Let's just scratch that out. So a protist, there we go. That's spelled better. A protist is an organism that's a eukaryote that is not an animal, plant, or fungus. And they are diverse, but as we've seen, they're not all closely related to each other, so they are not a clade, which is why we scrapped this kingdom. And because they're unrelated, they have different combinations of characters. Most of them are unicellular, some are multicellular, and they are multicellular in different ways. Some are nothing but, well, I shouldn't say nothing but they are basically almost like a big cell that is just a mass of protoplasm with a bunch of nuclei inside. Some are photosynthetic, some are heterotrophs, and some do both. Some are plant-like, like the algae. Some are animal-like, which you often hear referred to as protozoans. And this is the group, if we can call them a group, the group of eukaryotes that has the most complex cells known on Earth. So they have these single cells that do all these different jobs. The cell has to do all the jobs that your body does because of their single cell nature, and they're quite complex eukaryotes with a lot of different functions. So once again, if we look at a cladogram from your book, here's a cladogram, and I've circled here the three kingdoms that we're familiar with: land, plants, fungi, and animals. And then everything else on here are what we used to call the Protists, and now they have new clade names like excavata here and all these other things that we're not going to memorize. But we have all of these different groups. Here's the parabasalids like we saw in lab, and the ciliates, so on and so forth, all shown here. Here are the green algae, closely related to land plants, as you can see. So we're not going to talk about all of these. There's just simply not time, but we'll talk about a fair number of them. So starting with the parabasalids. This group has undulating membranes. Another characteristic of the group, they have reduced mitochondria called hydrogenosomes. I scratched it out by accident here. Hydrogenosomes. So they have like almost vestigial mitochondria. One member of this group is Trichomonas vaginalis, which causes trichomoniasis in females. This is an issue that leads to the breakdown of the vaginal lining. Another example is this one here, trypanosoma, which is transmitted by the vector called the tsetse fly. This leads to sleeping sickness, which involves coma followed by death. And what's crazy about this organism, I drew this up here. If you remember from Bio 1, cells have receptors in their membrane, and then we use those, so the body's defenses can recognize what cells in our body are our own cells and which cells are not. This organism changes its surface proteins each generation, so the body can't get a lock on it and can't destroy it. And up to a third of the genome of this organism is dedicated to changing surface proteins so it can evade immune systems. Here's an image of that. You can see the undulating membranes in this scanning electron photograph. The red blood cells are evident, as well as the parabasalid there. And of course, Trichonympha, we saw a couple species of this in lab. This is the one that lived inside the guts of termites. And inside of its cytoplasm here somewhere are bacteria. And this combination of bacteria and Trichonympha can then digest cellulose. Down into glucose, which then feeds the termites and feeds the parabasalid as well at the same time. Ciliates are another group that are very common. They're all over the pond waters that we've looked at, the pond water samples. They have two kinds of nuclei, a micronucleus, which is shared during a process known as conjugation, which is kind of like horizontal gene transfer in bacteria. They also have larger nuclei called a macronucleus. They don't, at least as far as we can tell, they don't sexually reproduce. They share DNA, these little nuclei, and then every once in a while they just split in half, but they don't actually do proper sexual reproduction. And they have very complicated cells with different structures inside, micronucleus, macronucleus. They have cilia, of course, contractile vacuoles, which they can use to squirt water out to change water balance and things like that. Complicated organisms that have a complicated life cycle. Like I said, these can be the most complex cells known. Have a look at this life cycle. We're not going to memorize it, but they fuse the nuclei together, and they They undergo meiosis and they split in half and they do all kinds of crazy things, but we're not going to memorize their life cycle. We will, however, look at some algal life cycles and plant and animal life cycles this semester. All right, so those are two of the single cell groups. Other groups, like the green algae, have both single-celled and multicellular members in this clade that we call the green algae. And I want to mention this as an important step in the evolution of multicellular life. So during the Precambrian, we saw the first multicellular organisms. And this starts with the evolution of simple multicellular organisms. And we can see descendants of these still today in the form of algae, and they form filaments, so like we see in this image, chains of cells. They probably, I guess I would assume they all arise from a single cell originally that divides, so they're all related to each other in that chain, of course. They can form hollow balls of cells or sheets of cells that almost look like a leaf. These cells are all stuck together, but they're unspecialized, meaning each individual cell has the full range of function as all the cells around it. It does all the things that it needs to do to survive. And each cell is in direct contact with the environment. So they're exchanging materials directly with the environment. And technically speaking, if you broke off one of those cells, it could grow into a whole new filament and it would be just fine. It can survive on its own and make more copies. So the cells are unspecialized. Now, once we get complex multicellularity evolving, and this actually appears to have happened many times, we have molecules called adhesion molecules, which help the cells to stick together. Cells begin to specialize, meaning an individual cell may not do all of the functions that the cells around it do. They have special jobs. So if you break off a cell, like if I break off a cell from your liver and throw it into the ocean, it's not going to grow into another human, right? It's just going to die. It can't do all of the tasks that it needs to survive. So we have specialized cells that leads then to tissues and organs, which have very specialized tasks. And in this case, only some cells of the organism contact the environment. So exchange only happens with specialized cells. And if you lose certain cells or tissues, it can be fatal to the whole organism. And we see this complex multicellularity evolve in algae, land plants, fungi, and the land animals, or not land animals, but all animals. The clade leading to animals. So we see this in animals, in fungi, in the green and red algae, as well as some of the brown algae. We see this evolve several times. And the land plants as well, which are not on this cladogram, I guess. But I guess green algae led to the land plants. So their multicellularity eventually led to the embryophytes, which are shown there, which are the land plants. Okay, so the green algae is an interesting group that consists of single cells, which you've seen in lab, colonies of cells, which means cells that are like unrelated to each other, same species but unrelated, living in a cluster, and multicellular organisms. So those filaments of algae, for example, and they contain both chlorophyll A and B, and they. I should point out that some of them have more of a complex multicellular arrangement with some organ development, like we see at the bottom there in the middle. They have chlorophyll A and B, and as I said, some are single-celled. You can see that here. Some are colonial or simple multicellular. Some are more complex. Chlorophyll A and B, this is something I wanted to mention because it's one of the things that they have in common and is homologous. Sorry, I drew through that, but with land plants. So they have that in common with the land plants that we'll go to next. There's a lot of complexity to their bodies and life cycles depending on the group you're looking at. If you look at this cladogram, you can see land plants here, and here's green algae, which includes the chlorophytes and the charophytes. No relation. No relation to me, anyway. So these two groups are the groups we call the green algae, which share a common ancestor with each other as well as the land plants. And land plants are derived, their closest relative, I should say, they share a common ancestor with a specific group of green algae called the charophytes. You should be able to remember the charophytes. But if we look at this cladogram up here, we can see those parabasalids that we talked about up at the top. Here's the parabasalids. This is, I think, a Euglena, which we didn't talk about, but it's another single-cell organism. Here is Paramecium bursaria, which is a ciliate. You've probably seen some diatoms in class, and you may have seen them in lab. We have red algae here that we've not really, I'm sorry, down here that we haven't really talked about, but they're another type of algae. Slime molds, which I have down here, are really cool, but we're not really going to talk about them much right now. But there's all kinds of diversity here that used to be lumped into the kingdom Protista. So this is not a clade, obviously. It could be a clade if you included animals, fungi, and plants in it and just, called all eukaryotes protists, but that would kind of defeat the point here. So we need to break them apart and give them all their own kingdom names. Another example of I want to talk a little bit about some of these that we have not seen in class but cause certain various diseases and things. I'll just talk about a few. One of them is Plasmodium. It's a group that is mostly a problem near the equator, but as you can see, in 1870 it was a problem all throughout the eastern and southern United States. And it causes malaria. It's transmitted by mosquitoes, and even today it kills around 900,000 people a year. Another one we can see here, Phytophthora infestans. This is a protist that caused the potato blight in Ireland, which led to lots of starvation and a lot of Irish individuals moving to the United States and Canada and other places in the 1800s. Now, another thing I want to mention about these organisms is their incredibly important role in the environment. They are the foundation of many food webs. This is one of the major components of plankton. So zooplankton are animals and protists that are really small. Like when you go to the zoo, right? You go to look at animals. So zooplankton are plankton that are animal or animal-like. And then there's phytoplankton, which is plankton that is algal or plant-like. Phytoplankton are photosynthesizers. And we breathe oxygen. All the oxygen that we breathe has a biological origin. It came from photosynthesis, and 30% of the photosynthesis on the planet comes from phytoplankton. This includes diatoms, algae, and other photosynthetic protists. And these make up the basis of the food web. We have protists that are producers, protists that are, so we have protists that are producers, we have prokaryotes that are producers, we have also animal and protist zooplankton that swim around like animals, right? And all of these things together in the oceans are consumed by things like shrimp, which are then consumed by fish, and all the way up to like the killer whale in this diagram. So all of these individuals eat one another or photosynthesize, taking CO2 and sunlight energy and build sugars that build up that food web, making life in the oceans possible, and also providing oxygen and food to those of us that live on land. So a very diverse group, more diverse than I'm possibly going to be able to talk about this semester. Hard to even decide what to talk about from this chapter, but I think I wanted to focus this chapter on your understanding of a few of the groups that we've seen in lab, some that cause certain diseases, a discussion of the evolution of eukaryotes through endosymbiosis and multicellularity, and which groups have multicellularity. So that concludes this chapter in a nutshell. I know it's a whirlwind tour, but check out the guided reading questions. And don't read, you can read about all the groups in here, but don't stress out about all the groups that we didn't talk about.